welcome. Thank you very much for joining us for this presentation on bereavement and loss today. So we're just going to introduce ourselves to start with. My name's Claire Gallagher and I'm a GP at Practitioner Health, where I've been for the last 9 years. And I originally started as a GP in North London, and then during some time abroad developed interest in occupational medicine and CBT. And then since then have been doing a combination. I worked in an eating disorder service alongside GP, and in more recent years for Practitioner Health. And we're going to be sharing today our experiences of bereavement and loss from the perspectives of the many different doctors and dentists who we've spoken to during these extremely difficult times that everybody's been having. So do you want to introduce yourself now, Eleanor?
Yes, I would. Good afternoon, everybody. I've been at Practitioner Health for the last 2.5 years as a psychiatrist. And prior to that, I was a consultant psychiatrist and medical manager in the London Mental Health Trust in London. And my interests are around quality service provision in the inner city, and I've now developed an interest in the mental health care of doctors and dentists. Thank you.
So just going to mention a couple of housekeeping sides of things. Given we're doing it in a webinar function today, there isn't any opportunity for people's voices to be heard, unfortunately. So we'll be using the Q&A function if you would like to either mention any questions or comments as we're going along, especially if things chime with you. There's no need to give your name if you prefer not to. It can be anonymous comment or with your name, but it is important not to mention the names of patients or specific workplaces. And everyone's going to be on mute anyway. So just to mention also, the group's being recorded so that it can be uploaded to our website for others to listen to if they haven't been able to join today. We have had some very good questions that were posed to us when people were joining this breakout group, which we're going to attend to during this presentation towards the end. So next slide, please, Mary. Just going to go through roughly what we're going to be talking about. So to think about some definitions of bereavement and grief, and then thinking onto the themes of loss in these really difficult times of COVID-19. Then we're going to, after a little bit of reflection time on how that sort of chimes with people, then thinking about this, Eleanor's going to think about the stages of grief, touching on complicated grief. And then towards the end, I want to link it to the emotions that happen during the normal stages of a crisis that are superimposed on these difficult emotions of grief. And then Eleanor's going to think a little bit about the way we can move forwards. And we've got some resources to share and some references. So next slide, please, Mary. So bereavement's the period after a loss during which grief is experienced and mourning occurs. And the duration of bereavement depends on both how attached the person was to the person who died and the amount of preparation time anticipating the loss. I think this last part is particularly pertinent during COVID times when much of the time nobody was anticipating the losses that have happened. And sometimes people are describing to me, you know, several people in one family or several people in one department being lost to COVID. So extremely distressing times. And grief being the normal process of reacting to the loss, and that grief reactions can be felt in response to the physical loss like death, or in response to symbolic or social losses, for example, loss of a job. And each type of loss means the person has had something taken away. And we particularly want to focus on this part next. Next slide, please, Mary. Thinking about all the many different losses that have been going on for everyone during these exceptionally difficult months we've just been having. So obviously the devastation of loss of a family member or a colleague, but also thinking about how how COVID has impacted on people being alone during their death and the distress at not being able to join family members at a time when somebody is very unwell. and the impact on funerals, and finding it difficult to go through the process of celebrating somebody's life together, and all the parts of mourning that are part of the witness to what's happening. But also we're thinking about other losses that are happening, sort of loss of people's identity and their role. I mean, we've had quite a few people, either from dentistry or surgeons, who just aren't able to practice their normal role at the moment. And then for dentists, that's come with a loss of income, also loss of people's routine or normality, but also feelings of security have been lost, and feelings of safety within the world that we live in. And obviously we've been going through tremendously difficult times in recent months, as has been mentioned by other speakers earlier today, and thinking about broader issues like climate change and Black Lives Matter that have been brought up earlier. So also thinking about people losing the things that they do to replenish leisure activities and things that make going back to work and dealing with more difficult things more possible. And all of those have been greatly reduced. So I don't know if any of those things chime for people, or if people want to make any comments in through the Q&A box. Please feel free to share, and through that Q&A box. And Mary, if you see anything that you want to draw to our attention, we're on Zoom, so we can't see the questions at the moment.
Yes, Mary, if you have, do you have any questions or thoughts that have come through? Because if not yet, I could just mention.
At the moment, we've just got the pre-submitted questions on the screen.
Right. Okay. So the pre-submitted questions are really helpful, and they broaden the theme to COVID in general, as well as bereavement and loss. So we're going to deal with those when we deal fully with the resources.
Yes.
So we'll come on to those ones. Do you want to share, Eleanor, any experience of loss through this time?
I think that I can think about my patients. I can also think in terms of myself, but I'll mention the patient first, where this was a loss which wasn't a loss of life, but it was a loss of routine and role of someone who was an intensivist, a senior clinician who also needed to shield. And here she was in this difficult situation, and they were able to be creative in that she moved in with parents because they were elderly, and that way they were supported. And then husband took on the role of supporting their child, because their child was going to school, and was able. The mother, my patient, knew that her child was being supported and could still go to school, because it would have been more difficult had she been in the house. So there was this loss of their routine, and it took a lot of thinking through, but she managed to find a creative way through. And on a personal level, I think the biggest one really has been, again, it wasn't a loss of life, although my neighbours, my mother's neighbour's mother died, but my mother's 90. And at a time when you really want to come close, and you don't know how many days you've got left, it was really difficult, very difficult indeed, managing those first few weeks of the lockdown. And it was an emotional experience for both of us, which has now been resolved in many ways. But this sense of, it touches all different levels. I was having music lessons, and my music teacher, he hasn't got a job, he's freelance, and then, that had to change. Less serious than some other people's loss, but it touches everyone. I've hardly met anybody who's not had a major change in their situation, their personal circumstances as a result of this pandemic.
I agree, and I think we'll come on to how are people going to move forwards with this when we've been through the grief part of it. So please could we have the next slide, Mary? And the next one as well, please. Yeah. So thank you, Eleanor. If you want to describe this.
Yeah, just to say a few points about grief and the stages of grief. Many of you will be familiar with the 5 stages of grief model, which was developed by Kubler-Ross in 1969. And what you see here is a modified Kubler-Ross grief model. Some experts, grief experts, have introduced 2 additional stages to the grief model, which are seen here asterisked. So the shock phase and the testing phase. The shock phase, sort of initial paralysis when you get this bad news, you can't do anything, you're not sure what to do. And then this other testing phase that where you're seeking realistic solutions. And it's quite helpful having this framework, because it helps us to less pathologize the grief experience. So coming on to my next slide, if you can, thank you. So just a little mention about what is grief, and it's been alluded to, but it's a normal process of reacting to a loss, and it's recognizing that a loss has taken place, and in that way can actually help us to heal. And it encompasses a variety of feelings and emotions which influence how we react and behave. There's no typical response, and although I've presented, or it has been presented, the stages of grief as though sequential, one can go through these stages in any order and repeat and revisit stages at a later stage. But the model helps to promote discussion and validation about the feelings that one has. And it might help us in thinking about our own observations and experiences of grief at this challenging time. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, grief can become complicated, and as you can see there, that in quotes, complicated grief, where a person who's bereaved feels stuck and in a struggle to cope with the emotional impact of their grieving. It's the result of a combination of circumstances. In other words, there are things that get in the way of that grieving process, and they relate in the main to the nature of that specific loss, of which life being lost is sometimes the most difficult many a time, personal, psychological factors, and also the quality of the supportive environment that you have. And if one is unable to cope with that grief, it's going to be harder to reach that final stage, which is the acceptance level. COVID has brought, if you can come to my next slide, thank you. Yes, and then COVID has brought additional challenges to us being able to manage this grief. So the self-isolation and the social distancing, and for instance, remote working, at a time when you need your friends, you need your family, you need the environment and the places to go to that can help you with your grief and help keep you healthy. And then in addition to that, there's an uncertainty about how long the period will last. And then there are the change in roles. That's brought an additional challenge to our ability to grieve. Changing roles in that while we may be grieving, we're suddenly taking on more caring roles for, let's say, homeschooling, looking after elderly parents, and can become quite overwhelmed with all of this and exhausted. So it has brought this additional challenge for us, and this is where conversations need to take place about, well, how can we better manage this situation? We don't want to assume that there will be definite complicated grief, but we know that the pandemic really has made a difference to how we are going to better manage. But one might say we have been forewarned and therefore have an opportunity to think a lot more about how we can manage these situations. Are we able to look at what's coming in, Mary, yes, in terms of questions at the moment?
Yes, so as a statement which is very relevant. So someone said there is something very profound about loss of family support and concern over family members who are very vulnerable.
I would really, really echo that. It's a very widely brought thing that people are thinking about their own safety in the workplace, and their family members are worried about that person's safety, and then people are having to worry on different levels about, in the original part of the whole process, whether their PPE was sufficient and whether family members were satisfied that they were going to be safe going to work, but then having to not see them when they came home because they were living elsewhere or trying to keep their family safe by self-isolating. So I think, yeah, that double whammy of both having increased reasons for being anxious about family members or about those shielding, whilst not being able to have the comfort of being with each other. I think that's been such a strong part of what people are bringing.
Well, that's right. And I mean, I came across this notion of anticipatory grief, where, you know, people, if you feeling the loss leads to a sense of being, you know, you're more likely to feel depressed in your mood. But this anticipation of an uncertainty of what might happen, particularly with your loved ones, coming into close proximity with them if you are somebody that can pose a risk, and then you get this anticipation leading to more anxiety. So it's another layer that's been added onto any grief that one might experience without the necessary supports that are normally there.
Any other questions or comments there, Mary, at the moment?
Yeah, an interesting one. Someone's just asked, are doctors prepared for death in training?
Gosh, that is a very, very interesting question. I received the most helpful set of instructions that we could pass on to doctors during the first peak of COVID, and we can certainly share after this webinar is over, which was from the University of Oxford about breaking bad news on the telephone, which took it to another level really, because it's hard enough in person, but needing to do it on the telephone, and also a set of guidance as to how to break news to children about parents who've died. And these extremely difficult conversations to be having, but it did bring to mind that it wasn't, I think we had a breaking bad news session once during medical school, but in contrast to how important it is to do it well. And I'm also bearing in mind, prior to COVID, a lot of anaesthetists on ITU had previously told me how difficult it is to break bad news to several families in the same week on call. And now in COVID times, this was happening to far more doctors and health professionals needing to cope with these really difficult interactions, whilst also being exposed to some of these things happening personally at the same time. So I think I'm just bearing all of those things in mind.
Well, that's right. I mean, a lot of healthcare staff have become like proxy relatives,
Yeah,
needing to support the patients at this time when their own relatives and close loved ones can't visit. But I think there are, I don't know the specifics, but there are simulation trainings that maybe some medical schools and other healthcare organisations provide. And I suppose it's one of those areas where it's not just about reading, it's something about having real conversations, either in training, discussed through your supervision, during group sessions that you have with your colleagues, and simulation training, being observed while having these very difficult discussions, and particularly if you're in training, the people that have just come out of medical school and so on, or junior trainees, there is a need there, definitely.
And I think medical schools these days are definitely on it more than they were when I trained. So I think that's a growth area for making things better for the future, for sure. Please, could I have the next slide, Mary?
Yeah.
I just wanted to sort of touch on the idea that we're not only dealing with the emotions that go with the grief or loss of various things at the moment, but also the emotions that go with managing in a crisis. And there's a very good TED talk by Amy Cuddy, and she describes these 3 stages. The first stage being a positive stage where people tend to feel energized to get things sorted out. So whether that be arranging more ICU beds or sorting out the PPE or sorting out remote working, or for some people adapting to home shielding. And people tend to feel good that they're pulling together as a team and that they're doing what they need to do, even though it's a difficult circumstance. Then in the second stage, she described it as regression, where people tend to feel irritable, have loss of motivation, loss of goals, and can't see the end in sight. And certainly at Practitioner Health, around the 12-week mark, I had a lot of people who were describing those very emotions, that it just felt hard to keep going with no sign on the horizon of the lockdown easing, although it has since, obviously. And this was drawn to my attention by somebody I was talking to that said the third quarter of a space mission, and I've put it in the reference list. It's a very good article. Apparently, if people are on a space mission or in a submarine, they've done research that shows about 3/4 of the way through the period of time, however long that might be, people get this fatigue and start to be irritable with their colleagues or at home. And a lot of people felt that, and I think many people can identify with that. And then she moved on to the recovery phase, where people tend to adjust to the situation, develop new goals, and regain their motivation to move forwards, which in many ways sort of echoes the acceptance phase in the grieving process. But I suppose it drawn to my attention that we can't properly go into recovery phase right now, because nobody knows if second wave is coming or if localized geographic spikes are coming. So it's very much with a kind of just one step at a time, one day at a time kind of approach, making small things to look forward to, seems to be helping people at the moment. I'm very conscious of the time, Mary. So
how long have we got?
We've got 4 minutes left.
Oh, great. Can we go on to the next slide, please?
Yeah.
So just to quickly say, we're thinking in terms of doctors needing to be able to step back at a time like this from their busy roles in order to recharge, ready for a possible second wave. But by doing certain self-care kind of things like taking a break, walks, which all sound very simple, but definitely people report feeling better when they do them. And then getting to share with others and focusing on the here and now rather than the worry phase. Obviously, it's helpful to plan for future events and how we're going to cope better with the second wave. Please, could you move on to the resources for us? Just wanted to really sum up in these last closing minutes. The Practitioner Health website and the BMA website both have large amounts of resources under the COVID-19 buttons. And just to draw to your attention, on the Practitioner Health website, there's under the COVID-19, there's a section called Access to Therapy. And that relates to one of the questions that was brought in, which was, what's the role of psychological practitioners to support staff during and following COVID-19? Just want to echo what Dr. Greenberger was saying, that different people responding differently to a trauma. And in the first instance, simple measures. But if things appear to be protracted, like nightmares or visions of the very difficult breathing situations people have seen and so on, seeking evidence-based care being the right thing to do. And I don't know about you, Eleanor, but definitely people were too busy looking after people in their jobs to look up, to have any time to think about their own needs.
Well, that's right. I mean, usually they work until the job is done.
Yes.
Which is beyond the capacity. But I too echo what came out of Professor Neil Greenberg's talk, in that simple strategies work.
Yes.
At quite apart, simple strategies as an individual, then beyond that, what you can do within your teams, caring teams, and then beyond that, obviously, more larger resources that are developed through various organisations and so on.
I agree. And one of the questions was, how do we support those who are supporting those in distress? And I think thinking of it in that team, organisation and individual level is helpful, but also thinking in the ways of clinical supervision, if people can access that, or Baylink groups or Schwartz rounds, or peer support, which there's a number of different, one of them, one access to peer support is through PH. But also providing people with opportunities to reflect on this difficult work that people are doing. And there's going to be 3 COVID support groups running for 6 weeks through PH, where people have had impact on their work or personal life by COVID, and more can be set up should there be a demand for those.
Yes.
One other question was, what can be done to help or support doctors who've suffered badly with COVID-19 themselves and then feel anxious and worried about returning to work? And it was drawn to our attention that a good occupational health assessment, if people are able to access that, to make sure they're ready for work. And then I liked the idea brought earlier in one of the talks about having a buddy, somebody looking out for somebody when they return to work, checking whether people feel overwhelmed. How many minutes left?
We've got 20 seconds, so we're
right.
up now.
Just finishing on Claire Gerarda and Caroline Walker's Time and Space to Grieve During COVID-19, also included on the resource list. Building in regular time for the team to come together, considering the broader losses of